This is our special post-debate coverage. It's in the books. The very first debate between President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden. Almost had a Joe Biden moment there, respectively, the Republican and the Democratic nominee for president. We've got a great show lined up for you here today. We will be joined by Henry Williams, who's the executive director of the Gravel Institute, in just a little bit. And a little later on, Dr. Jody Dean, who's a professor at Hobart and William Smith College and also a noted author. So quite a bit to say here. Fantastic show lined up. Thank you to everyone who is already watching us. But quite a bit of quality content. Monica, how can people make sure others don't miss it?
Before we get into it, make sure to hit that share button on whatever platform you're watching this on. And if you aren't already, take the moment now to hit follow BT Newsroom at BT Newsroom on Twitter and Instagram. You can find us at Breakthrough News on Facebook and YouTube. Follow, hit that share button right now. We are giving you the analysis, the perspectives we can promise you will not hear anywhere else.
You know, there's so many ways we could probably start here. There's a lot to be said. We'll try to get in as much as possible. I think for me, and before we go to the guests, just some top lines, maybe the major issue and the major takeaway for me is, despite the fact that we are facing global crises of humanity on a range of different issues, there's actually multiple crises of humanity, we didn't actually hear that much of substance about them. There was a lot of mudslinging, a lot of name calling, a lot of back and forth, very little substance in terms of what will be done. And even many of the things that were stated in terms of what would be done, except for maybe perhaps some of Trump's lies about what he would accomplish, what was stated about what the politicians would do are not solutions that will really meet the scale of these problems, will really meet the challenges that are not only facing the United States, but facing the world. And I think just right on its face, right there, Monica, that is I don't know if it's the biggest letdown, because this is maybe par for the course with what we've seen from the political discourse in this campaign, but it certainly seems like a complete and total abdication of responsibility by two people claiming that they want to be the leader of the United States and, in their words, the leader of the world. So, I mean, it's hard to even know exactly where to start here. I would say that without any doubt at all, if you were watching this, certainly as a foreign leader in any foreign country, you have to be saying, let's all plan for American decline right away, because there's no way that either of these two people are going to address these challenges or get this thing back on track.
I think that's exactly right, Eugene. I mean, I haven't said this since my high school civics class, but as an American citizen, I am mortified watching this debate, seeing two candidates that 50% of Americans don't believe are mentally fit to even hold the seat in the White House. I mean, it's just really horrifying. And it's just really, I think what's most telling about this entire election, and even so much of the commentary that we're hearing from the liberal and the conservative media establishment, the fact that each candidate's main selling point is that they're not the other guy, to me signals a huge problem, a huge crisis in what we call the greatest democracy in the world. So I'll keep it at that to get right to our guest.
Absolutely. Well, and we've got a couple guests coming up here. First, we want to bring in Henry Williams, the executive director of the Gravel Institute. Henry, really appreciate you joining us here on Breakthrough News this evening.
Hi, glad to be here.
Just maybe to start off, maybe just give me your top line thoughts about what we saw here tonight.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing you have to keep in mind from the beginning is that Trump has gone so far to the right and taken the landscape of this election so far to the right that what we're seeing again and again in this debate is they're competing who can be further right, who can punch the left harder, who can say more that they don't want to do a Green New Deal, who can praise cops more. I mean, in reality, what you're seeing between the two of them is they live in this kind of hyper reality where rather than addressing the real and present crises in front of people's eyes, right now, what we're hearing about instead are these, manufactured media crises on both sides for both of them. And I think worse than that is that neither of them really seem to express the kind of deep and necessary humanity that is so needed at a moment like this.
Yeah, no, I think that's an extraordinarily good point. I think the point about humanity is maybe the key point. I mean, it certainly seems that this is a time with hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions of people with the coronavirus, that there'd be some human empathy. But it really seemed on the COVID-19 crisis, Henry, that it was really just about who could get one-upsmanship. And that almost felt like the entire debate. And I wonder if, from your perspective, that's maybe not a mistake. I mean, that the TV networks and all of that, to some degree, this kind of WWE style of debate is maybe what they're looking for.
Right. I want to say off the bat, I think Chris Wallace is probably one of the worst moderators in the history of presidential debates, and I think he should honestly be ashamed of himself for his performance tonight. We've been seeing Trump's antics now for 5 years on the national political stage, and yet Chris Wallace and the networks that covered this debate were unwilling to do anything to address all the techniques that Trump has used since day one of the primaries. They didn't turn his mic off. They didn't turn Biden's mic off. They didn't actually stop or interrupt either of them when they took it off topic, when they took it to personal attacks, and they didn't follow up with facts when they lied. At the end of the day, they're just not willing to do that because they know that this makes good TV either way, regardless of what the truth is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the point couldn't really be made well. I mean, I was actually, as you were talking, trying to remember in my own mind all of the moderators and who maybe had been worse. I haven't come up with one yet, so I'm going to give you Chris Wallace on that right now. I mean, it even seemed to me at times that he was trying to maybe even help Biden by kind of cutting him off when he was rambling. And I don't know, maybe you could argue that's better for the quality of the debate, but it did seem at times that Chris Wallace's obvious exasperation with Trump. I mean, whatever we feel about Trump, this itself will become a talking point that, at least in my view, could help Trump starting tomorrow, because all of his surrogates will be saying Biden had an earpiece and he wouldn't check. He didn't have a drug test. Chris Wallace was on his side. And I just wonder, from your perspective, for Trump, is it positive or negative, no matter what people are saying about him, that all the coverage is on him?
Yeah, I mean, this is the technique that Trump has employed since he entered our sort of national consciousness. He understands, so long as he controls the narrative, whatever that narrative is, he can spin it to his advantage. I think that's what he and his team thought about tonight's debate. They said, speak as much as you possibly can, get as many attacks as you can in. And I think that, the unwillingness of Chris Wallace to really step into the debate, or more importantly, the unwillingness of him to ensure that it followed a trajectory grounded in reality, grounded in the actual crises facing our country, means that what we actually got was, again, the Trump show as we usually get it, in its usual form. But worse than that, I think what we got is the sort of unmitigated slew of just a hodgepodge of what's been in the headlines the last few weeks. What I would have really liked to have heard out of this debate is, let's present both candidates with the facts. 8 million people unemployed, 200,000 people dead of the coronavirus, and more importantly than that, Congress having not passed a single bill to aid the American people since March. That topic didn't even come up once at this entire debate, and yet there are literally 8 million people living hand to mouth. There are people under threat of homelessness and starvation, and we did not hear about them once tonight, but instead we managed to get a full 5 minutes about Trump and the size of his rallies relative to those of Biden. I mean, that is an unconscionable moral sin, and I think, honestly, everyone involved with the production of this debate should be ashamed of themselves.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. A couple of issues I want to bring out. I mean, in terms of other issues that were left out, I think an important issue, and again, you are the executive director of the Gravel Institute, and one of the major issues that when Mike Gravel was in the Democratic primary, he raised that he really wanted to bring to the forefront was foreign policy, issues surrounding U.S. imperialism. I mean, China was mentioned kind of tangentially, but maybe I missed it, but it seems foreign policy issues and America's role in the world, by and large, nothing, crickets.
Yeah, I think one thing you have to keep in mind here is that neither side is really willing to lean on foreign policy as an issue. I think that Biden is a little embarrassed about his record, not just on China, but the number of times that his viewpoint, and you have to remember, Biden's been in public life since Mike Gravel. They actually won in the same election year, and Mike Gravel is now 90 years old, so that definitely gives you some perspective on how long Joe Biden has been in politics. The decisions that he's made in that time, those decisions on China, the decisions on foreign policy, are not the kind of thing that he wants to come up and defend. And that's why he'll skirt the topic. And when it comes to Trump, I don't think he has ever had a really coherent view or strategy. You hear him bash China today and talk about his ban on China. Listen to what he was saying about China and their coronavirus response in January, what he was saying every time that he spoke to Xi in the 3 years before that. Ultimately, the story that you get here is on both sides really a lack of a coherent theory or strategy of America's presence in the world. And I think you can trace this all the way back to 2001, since the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and since the real collapse of a neoconservative, let's police the world viewpoint, because of the tremendous failure of the war on terror since then, neither side has really come up with a new consensus or a new approach to the world since then. And all that they can do is try to dodge the subject and hope that Americans don't care. And the tragic reality is that when it's not in headlines, when it's not something that we talk about, Americans often seem content to forget about the fate of the rest of the world.
I think that's 100% true. I think it's one of the most interesting elements of sort of U.S. politics, certainly about lesser of two evil politics, is the contradiction about, well, what's better for who, and it's never talked about what's better for those who are being murdered by drone strikes. I mean, one other issue that I really want your thoughts on here, obviously Trump, I think this was widely expected, trying to drive a wedge into at least the prospective Democratic coalition, making the point, that Joe Biden wasn't, well, really trying to expose the fact that there is difference between Biden and Bernie Sanders. A few interesting things here. At the end, Biden noting that his climate jobs might not necessarily be a $15 an hour minimum wage, despite the fact he's running on that. I mean, to some degree, I don't know how people take this because it's coming from Trump, but do you think at all, Henry, that the slight exposure here, it wasn't a major issue of the debate, of Biden saying directly that he is against many of the things that the base of people who he needs to support him want, is ultimately going to hurt him, or have, those who are looking at this maybe already made up their minds?
Yeah, what I want to really focus on here is this question of the huge problems facing this country and our world today. The reality is that median wages in America and in the developed world in general have stagnated since the 1970s. The reality is that we had a jobless recovery since 2008. We've been in a state of stagnation or outright collapse in nearly every sector of American society since 2008, really. And I think the recovery has been really not meaningful to the average person. And yet, despite that, people like Biden continually see, when they're faced with someone like Trump, who will fearmonger about the left, who will bring up the idea of these plans being radical or one of these things, they piss their pants. And as a result, the only thing that they can think to do is constantly disavow people who are trying to address the scale and severity of those problems. And the problem is our two-party system and the sort of mainstream sort of window of political debate has moved so far away from reality that to simply suggest solutions at the level of the scale of the problem, solutions like Medicare for All or Green New Deal, which simply try to address how bad and how out of control the problems have become, you're painted as a radical, and people will say, look at how huge, look at how massive this plan is. What they never say and what they never look at is, look at how huge the problem is. In America, after this crisis, it looks like you could have as many as 40 million people unemployed in the richest country on earth, 40 million people who cannot receive health care when they need it. And yet, the number one thing that Biden said about healthcare this debate is, I'm not Bernie. I beat Bernie. I don't believe in those plans. I don't have any affirmative plan for giving people healthcare. And he was more afraid of getting painted as a radical than he was of not having a solution to get 40 million Americans care.
I think you're exactly right. Just to jump in here and bring it back to this uprising that we've seen really just take over the entire nation from coast to coast since the murder of George Floyd back in May. And we haven't seen, of course, not from Trump, but even from Biden, anything more than just rhetorical support for Black Lives Matter, yet he's calling for the prosecution of anarchists. I mean, is a thought crime now a thing in the United States? And it was also funny hearing him talking about, Antifa is not a group. So how does he reconcile that with his comments on arsonists and anarchists needing to be rounded up and charged with crimes? So what do you make of this this uprising that 71% of Americans agree that the Black Lives Matter movement has brought to light real issues of racial inequality in this country? What do you think about how young voters must be feeling? Of course, many of which who supported Bernie and were pretty disappointed and hopefully not too shocked to see once again how the Democratic Party establishment just totally iced him out.
Yeah. This is another case where I think you have to look at Biden's history. You know, as I said, he won his election in 1972, the same year as the 90-year-old Mike Gravel, and he entered as a liberal sort of figure where his view was we need to compromise with the segregationists, we need to compromise with racist Southern Democrats, and we need to essentially sell out the black voters of the Democratic Party. And, you know, at the end of the day, since then, obviously, Biden has gone through shifts in his politics. But, you know, what you can see in him today, I think, is competing instincts and forces. You know, he is not aware of the scale of the problem in the current moment, but he's also not really aware of how things have changed on the ground, of the change in thinking. He scorns and disagrees with the young people in the party who are telling him that there's a fundamental problem here. But he also understands that there's a part of the base and there's a part of the party that's asking him to acknowledge these real issues. And so what he'll do is he'll give it lip service. He'll say, well, I care about black people. I care about Black Lives Matter. But if you ask him about his record, and more importantly, if you ask him about real policies that he could pursue, he's mum on it. He's silent on it. And he also needs to make racist appeals to law and order because in his mind, he's trapped by these competing political instincts. And he's trying to flank Trump to the right while still sort of handing empty words to his base on the left. The tragic thing is because his party is stuck in a place where they're not willing to embrace the energy or the diversity in their party, and instead they are trying to sort of capitalize on that for the sake of their votes without granting them either any meaningful concessions or even addressing with other solutions, with other suggestions, the problems that are raised by those people. And, you know, when you really cut through all the bullshit of this year, Black Lives Matter has taken a massive stage in national media. I mean, the NBA had it on their court. People talk about this, and it's certainly something that's being discussed. But despite that, we're seeing one of the largest decreases in black wealth in American history since the Great Depression. The black middle class is being completely eroded. Home ownership is being eroded. Black unemployment is something like 3 or 4 times higher than those for white people. And as Biden correctly said, 1 in 1,000 black people in America have died of COVID. You know, if you really stare at those issues and you say, what is Biden actually proposing to deal with that fundamental inequity other than saying, I support you, I agree with you? That doesn't matter to us because Democrats have been saying that for, you know, decades now, but they have still been pushing the same set of policies since Joe Biden made his sort of liberal turn in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very relevant point. And I want to pick up on some of this. And again, that's Henry Williams we're talking to. Stay with us still, Henry. I want to bring in our executive director of the Gravel Institute, I should say. I want to bring in our next guest, Dr. Jody Dean, professor at Hobart and William Smith College. First and foremost, Jody, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Well, you know, I wanted to stick with this issue here of the broader issue of the uprising that's happening in this country. And your town in upstate New York, Geneva, New York, Jody, has seen a number of very significant protests around the issues arising from George Floyd. We know that really the touchstone of that movement has been the call to defund the police. Now, that came up briefly here in the debate. Here's what Joe Biden, who claims to believe that Black Lives Matter, had to say about the main slogan of the uprising.
There's systemic injustice in this country, in education and work and in law enforcement and the way in which it's enforced. But look, the vast majority of police officers are good, decent, honorable men and women. They risk their lives every day to take care of us. But there are some bad apples. And when they occur, when they find them, they have to be sorted out.
Jody Dean, just a few bad apples, he says. What do you make of that?
That's a pretty dominant Democratic Party and Republican Party line. Right? They refuse to acknowledge the systemic features of policing. They refuse to acknowledge the fact that policing was born out of slave patrols and attacks on workers in the North, that it's a structure that's specifically designed to support a particular kind of race and class hierarchy. So the very first element of it is to deny anything structural about the way policing works and to reduce it to individual people, and then to say that, well, not all individuals are bad and it's just going to be a few bad apples. So in a lot of ways, Biden's position here is not surprising, right? I mean, unfortunately, from this perspective of those of us who are really concerned about deep systemic inequality, a majority of poll respondents these days don't want to defund the police. Right? They are threatened by that. And so Biden is playing to those voters to say, look, please don't think that I'm one of the, that I'm a radical guy. I'm not a radical guy. I agree with everybody else. I'm just Mr. Mainstream.
It's such a relevant point that you're making there, Jody, and I think that maybe it speaks to another issue that exists in this election, and that maybe I teed you up for this, but the issue of a few bad apples in policing, I think, can maybe be drawn out a little bit to this election. I mean, as you say, there's nothing structural presented. It's sort of the other guy is bad, you bring me in, and I'm going to fix all your problems, which I think almost every person on the street may know is a completely ridiculous way of looking at the impact of elections, but it still is the way that this entire thing is framed.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Eugene, and it makes me think of the way, what was the debate that we just saw? I mean, honestly, like, I'm 58 years old. I was pretty horrified. I found it like deeply upsetting and depressing, and then I started thinking, I started thinking, like, what's going on here besides the fact that there's just like yelling and screaming here. It's that the things that the two parties actually share, that's completely hidden. The fact that both parties have support of Wall Street and major corporate donors, the fact that most of the financial class, most of the corporate elite give money, heavily donate to both parties, right? You wouldn't see that at all. The way that both parties are so invested in keeping a particular race and class structure going in the United States, you can't see that from these debates, right? Trump screaming and yelling and Biden sort of trying to hold on. I mean, it masks the kind of larger scale, deep rooted kind of corruption and identity between those parties.
Jody, I want to tie this into another issue that disproportionately impacted the Black community, and that, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic, as Biden said himself. But where was Biden when Amazon was price gouging essential goods throughout the pandemic? Where was he when billionaires were profiting while millions lost their jobs and tens of thousands lost their lives? And why didn't he, as the leader of the Democratic Party, call for a nationwide cancellation of rent, call for just these basic protections to make sure that people could survive and actually stay inside their homes, be able to socially distance, not be able to go as essential workers and risk their lives every single day to pay their rent and pay their bills. Again, the issue of canceling these things during a pandemic, as we've seen dozens of other countries do across the world, not even something that is within the realm of possibility in the United States. What do you make of all of that?
That's such a good point. After all, he did just say, I am the Democratic Party in one of his responses to Trump. So it can't just be like, well, there are a lot of us, there's a bunch of different views. That's not the way he presented himself. And he has not called for canceling the rent. He has not called for making sure that no one can be fired during this. He didn't call for making sure that every business continues to fund all of their workers so that they won't lose their jobs. I mean, there's silence about that. Right. He did mention a little bit when they talked about the K curve, right? That's a K recession where some people at the top are benefiting and most of the people at the bottom are not. But he didn't say anything about, so what do we do about that? Right. It was not like, let's make the banks pay for the lost income from the rents and mortgages. He didn't say anything like that. So there's not a sense that, I think for someone who has not read his campaign program in any detail, you wouldn't come away with a sense of that he's going to do anything. In fact, you wouldn't come away with a sense that he's going to change anything, which is pretty much where he is, right? I actually feel like that Biden's unstated slogan is, I'm actually the guy who will make America great again, in the same way that it's Trump. Trump says that in a bellicose way, But Biden wants to hold on to the world that was, let's say, in 2014, 2015, not acknowledging, as Henry brought up, the deep devastation that the Great Recession did to working class households, and particularly African American households, who lost 53% of their wealth because of the Great Recession, when American households in general lost 40% of their wealth. So we don't see any of that. We saw, oh, we had this great recovery, we really helped, but not the deepening of structural inequality that occurred.
Yeah, Henry, please get back in.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the structure of Biden's answer that you played just there at the clip, if everyone remembers. He said something, and I think it's very revealing when you look at the way he answered that question. He said, yes, I acknowledge that there's deep structural and systemic racism in America, but I support all law enforcement and there's just some bad apples. Notice that he acknowledges the structural racism, but he doesn't move to, here's my plan to solve that. Here are the ways that I'm going to improve the material conditions of the worse off in America, or of black people in America. What he says is, let me pivot right. Let me tell you, here's how I'm acknowledging but not moving forward on systemic racism, and here's how I'm also going to feint right on law and order and on the police. And what that tells you is what I'm saying about Biden and his campaign not actually having a theory of this race or of how to deal with issues in America. They feint left and then they feint right. And on neither side are they really offering any serious solution to the issues that they're talking about. And again, as Professor Dean brought up, this idea of bad apples, which has been a talking point since the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, it's like a broken record. They say it over and over and over again. And now they're also a broken record on systemic racism. They will say it over and over again. But when it comes to what are you going to do to change those underlying conditions, they are remarkably quiet.
And as I mentioned before, we are joined here by Henry Williams, who is the executive director of the Gravel Institute, and Dr. Jody Dean of Hobart and William Smith College. Henry, before we let you go, I want to play another clip and get both of your response to this. Obviously, the big news that the New York Times broke, I believe it was Sunday afternoon, around Donald Trump's tax returns, obviously came up in the debate. Here's some of Trump's response here.
You paid millions of dollars.
Millions of dollars.
So
yes.
not $750.
Millions of dollars, and you'll get to see it. And you'll get to see it. But let me just tell you, Chris, let me just tell you something, that it was the tax laws. I don't want to pay tax. Before I came here, I was a private developer. I was a private business people. Like every other private person, unless they're stupid, they go through the laws, and that's what it is.
Unless they're stupid. Henry, your thoughts on that clip and Trump, this whole kerfluffle?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think that underlying all of this is a kind of contempt for ordinary people. You see it in Trump, and I think you also see it in Biden in how dismissively he waves away the left, in how he waves away people on the ground. I think Biden is very good at performing empathy, and I think he's very good, maybe one-on-one, at being a kind person and being nice to people. But somebody made a really good point earlier. The Gravel Institute, we tweeted something about how Biden had said, had defended his son Hunter and defended that people suffering from drug addiction deserve dignity and respect. And I think it's good that he said that, and it's meaningful that he would say that when Trump would not. But at the same time, if you look at the actual policies that he has supported and will support, it shows the exact opposite of that. So in both cases, and I think you see this in what Trump's saying as well, it's this kind of disdain for the real consequences of their actions and for the real people out in America. Trump has been detached from the world of everyday people since the day he was born, and Joe Biden has been since the day he was elected to the Senate. And both of them have existed in the world of national media and of rhetoric and of money and powerful people their entire adult lives. Both of them are so alienated from the experience of poverty, the experience of want or need. Even for someone like Joe, who maybe experienced it in his childhood, for him it's become a rhetorical signifier. It's become a political weapon that he has used his entire career, rather than a source of empathy from which he would draw the policies that actually would help people currently suffering from poverty and injustice and racism.
Thank you, Henry. Again, Executive Director of the Gravel Institute. We really appreciate your time tonight, your important insight, and of course the work that you do with the Institute. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jody, I'd love to get your reaction to this clip. I think one of the most ironic moments of the night was when Trump pointed to the tax code and policies of the Obama administration as the reason why he was able to get away with this tax evasion. What do you make of this?
Oh, can Jody hear us? She might have lost us. Oh, you got me.
Yeah, but I can't. I hear you, but I don't see a clip.
Oh, the one we just played. Did you not hear the one that we just played of Trump?
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Please, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, on the tax code. So what Trump says is what everybody knows is true, namely that the tax code is written to benefit the rich. And what the kind of rule of mainstream politics is, let's pretend that everything is for the good of the people. Let's pretend it's going to help middle class and working class families, when in fact it's not. And so I think that what's really interesting about Trump's kind of deep cynicism is he means what he says when he says, look, the code was written to benefit people, if they can, to benefit rich people, developers, people like me, and if we can get away with it, we will. And if you don't, then basically you're a sucker. Or if you don't, then you're someone who has believed in a kind of dream of American fairness that's just completely not there at all. So and the thing with Biden is he wants to play by the old rules that say, oh, we can pretend that, I don't know, like all of the work that he did for decades to benefit the credit card companies that are all based in Delaware, that all of that work was somehow really just to make sure that people got better credit, not in order to gouge them and benefit those companies.
Yeah, no, I mean, fantastic point on all counts there. And certainly we just want to remind people who are watching, if you get an opportunity, hit the share button. Obviously, we've had such great content so far. We will have more content moving forward here. We have Dr. Jody Dean with us, author of many books, but including the recent Comrade, great book. I'll just plug that here. I enjoyed it. Nevertheless, to keep pushing forward here, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of cynicism in a different context, but it did make me think of something, Jody. In 2016, I think it was something like 100 million odd voters did not vote. I myself did a little calculations on this. About 74 million of them seem to be sort of unambiguously working class. Now, we know vote shaming is huge. The blaming of people who don't vote is huge. But if you are a non-voter watching this tonight, I mean, it has to seem like to some degree your cynicism about the electoral process is being, at least to some degree, borne out.
I think in some ways that we should acknowledge that non-voting is a choice for none of the above, and that it is not something to be shamed at all, but it's just something to say, if the system is not offering up someone who, let's say in particular working class interests, that represents the concerns that you have in your life, then a choice for none of the above is still a choice. And for a long time in the U.S. politics, there are a lot of us who don't want to choose what's given to us on the mainstream ballot. And for some it'll mean they won't vote at all. For some it'll mean that they'll vote third party and not for one of the two mainstream candidates. I think as we acknowledge it, that we should also say that, I think it's important to say that voting is something important. And it's the deep corruption of our system, because it's so much for the benefit of a corporate capitalist financial class, that they have made it so that your vote is important, but we're not going to give you something worth choosing, right? And so it's like they've taken something that was ideally supposed to be part of people's participation in self-government and made it really an instrument for how are you forced to choose your own oppressor?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point, and I think that obviously, it's one that tens of millions of people agree with here. I think that it really is. one of the most odious elements of the election system, as it were, this idea that somehow the biggest challenge is the individual voter. Like, if you found the candidates wanting, somehow it's your fault for finding them wanting, not for the political system that's allegedly a democracy to find a way to meet the needs, wants, desires, ideas, or whatever it may be in a fair way in the election system. But I'm glad that you raised the issue of voting as important, because obviously the debate ended on a note of the broader issue of concessions, voter suppression, mail-in ballot, and it does seem like there is something of a, I don't want to call it a standalone issue, but a very relevant issue of the battle for democracy here, that especially the Republicans, it seems, are really trying to play up the idea that in a way you don't have the right to vote, and that it's, almost openly saying it's better for fewer people to vote.
Absolutely, I think that's been deliberate Republican policy. Well, we know that was actually also Democratic policy during the Jim Crow era, with all of the different laws and rules about who get to vote and having to sign up, and all of the different complicated ways that they tried to make sure that Black people, particularly in the South, weren't able to vote. But it's a specific strategy of the Republicans. They do it by gerrymandering. They do it by all sorts of different kind of vote challenges. They do it by, they've reinstated different kinds of voter ID laws in different states and confused the issue so that people don't even know what kind of voter ID is required. They make voting harder than it needs to be. They have fewer voting places. I mean, if we were a system that valued voting as much as all the pundits seem to value it every 4 years, then we would actually have a much easier way to do it. It wouldn't be so endlessly complicated. It wouldn't be hard to register, and it wouldn't be hard to vote. So I actually think that if the pundits and the Democrats, who always say, oh, vote, 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 and try to guilt the left into it all the time, if they really believed it, they would actually make it something that would be as even easier than getting a driver's license.
That's right. And a huge issue that has been in the headlines, in the mainstream media, is this phenomenon of the Red Mirage, the idea that because so many Democratic voters are choosing to mail their ballots in, it might appear on election night that Trump is winning, but of course with the anticipated, incredibly slow process of counting all these mail-in ballots, it might go to show that Biden is actually winning. And of course, as we just saw, Trump is refusing, or saying that he's going to refuse to concede. He's already been riling up his support, his base of support for months, on the idea that mail-in ballots are fraudulent, all of these things. And the fact that Trump has an arsenal of tools at his disposal to be able to contest the results of the elections, the election, even if it does show that Biden won, is really just, I think, a bigger testament to the failings of what we call the greatest democracy, or not what we, but what is called the greatest democracy, what our politicians call the greatest democracy in the world, right? And just to really throw it back, the fact that this is 2.5 centuries of a process that has not been updated at all. The Electoral College was literally founded on the idea that working and poor people aren't independent or informed enough to vote, and it was designed to insulate the government from the masses of the American people, and again, to really diminish the power of the vote of everyday people. So in this context, what do you make of that?
Well, everything you said is so important. I mean, the Electoral College is a guarantee of an elite structure, along with the Supreme Court, right? These are some of the elements in the U.S. system that are designed to let it always have a ruling class and a suppressed and ruled class. And also, I wanted to add into what you were saying about all of the measures that are at kind of Trump's disposal. I don't know if y'all noticed, but in part of the question related to Charlottesville, and would Trump, tell his white supremacist supporters, that to stand down and that kind of thing. And he said, I would tell the Proud Boys to stand down and stand by. And I think that was quite deliberate. I think that he also did not say, when Chris Wallace asked him about, asked them both about, would you tell your supporters not to go out in the streets and not to do anything during the month as votes are being counted. He didn't say that he would not do that. And in fact, I think that his signal to the Proud Boys was very much part of a signal that that Republicans and their extreme supporters should be willing to go out and protest during that period. And I think it's a real. I don't know. Actually, I don't know what I think about the Democrats. Like, I don't think that they are willing to fight against a foe that they think, that they tell us is the worst threat to democracy the United States has ever had. I mean, I think that if they really believed that, then they would actually want to have people out in a social movement in the streets. I mean, that was the core of the Bernie Sanders campaign, was the movement. It was never about just Bernie. It was about, as he would always say, bringing people back into the political process. And even at this time where things are at a precipice, it didn't seem like Biden was willing to say that, or willing to really recognize the stakes that ostensibly we're facing.
Well, talking about bringing people back into the process, and Bernie Sanders, obviously one of the major themes of Bernie Sanders' campaign is the corporate control of the election process, the billionaire class. We have a graph we want to bring up here. I'll tell you what it says as well. It's outside spending coming from so-called super PACs. Already we have crossed the $1 billion mark. Already we've crossed the $1 billion mark. Undoubtedly, this will be, as the last election was actually, the most expensive election. I'm just talking about outside spending here. There's obviously many, many millions more dollars. I mean, what does that really say about whose vote counts?
It's like, they got the money, right? In our kind of electoral system, it's driven by lots and lots of media messaging, and whether or not it's network media or mainstream media, and consultants and ad buys, and that stuff is expensive. It's not like it was in the 19th century and even early 20th century, where elections involved face-to-face generating people power, right? Where elections were really a game of numbers of people involved in building support. Now it's a much fewer people with much more money.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I really appreciate you, Dr. Jody Dean of Hobart and William Smith College. Thank you so much for joining us here on Breakthrough News.
Oh, thanks so much. I enjoyed it. Y'all take care.
The pleasure was all ours. And thanks again to our earlier guest, Henry Williams, the executive director of the Gravel Institute. We're going to get ready to bring this to a close, but those of you who have been watching have seen the names scrolling at the bottom of your screen here. These are our patrons who we love. Monica, how can people support us?
One really important way you can support us, in addition to sharing this video right now, following us on social media, is becoming a patron. Check out our Patreon page, patreon.com/breakthroughnews. We have 3 tiers of giving, and each of these tiers come with exclusive gifts, exclusive access to content that we're working on here every single day at Breakthrough. And of course, like I said in the beginning of the show, and I think that is very, very clear from every statement that has been made in the past 40 minutes or so, this is perspectives, this is analysis that you're not going to hear anywhere else here on Breakthrough. We have been covering the circus of this 2020 presidential race since day one. And as well, we've been on the ground covering this uprising that we have seen rock this nation, rock the entire world since the killing of George Floyd. It was through our patrons, the generosity of those who donate to us every month, that we were able to be on on the ground in Minneapolis as soon as this uprising popped off 3 months ago. And in order for us to continue this critical work, to continue to challenge the narratives that we hear from the corporate press, whether liberal or conservative, we are here literally breaking through, giving you the perspectives from an analysis, a history rooted in struggle, rooting in the experiences of poor, working class, and oppressed people across this country and across this entire world. We know independent media is so critical in a time like this, and again, we need your support to continue this work. So please check us out, patreon.com/breakthroughnews. We are so grateful, so thankful to our viewers, and once again, hit share right now, hit follow at BT Newsroom on Twitter and Instagram. Find us Breakthrough News on YouTube and on Facebook. We need your support to keep us going.
Monica Cruz, as always, it's a pleasure to be here with you on Breakthrough News. I'm Eugene Puryear, and as we always say, don't just watch us, join us on Breakthrough.